All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Molly Carmichael. I'm the communications manager at the state office, the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin. Thank you so much for joining us today for Disinformation in Democracy. It's really great to see you all. Just a reminder that this meeting is being recorded, and we'll send that out probably sometime tomorrow. Also, all of the other relevant information that we'll be including will also be in the follow-up, so don't rush to try to get all of the different links and to dig through our website, though this will also be on our website. Closed captions are enabled for this meeting, and you can turn those on by clicking the CC icon at the bottom of your screen. If you have any issues turning the closed captions on or are having any sound or technical difficulties, feel free to message me in the chat function, and then feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We're just doing name, pronouns, and location right now. We're going to do all of our questions and answers at the end of the hour. So as we go, just feel free to put those questions in the chat, and we will get to them at the end. So before we introduce our speaker, I want to give you all just a little bit of context about the work the League is doing on mis and disinformation. So countering mis and disinformation is a top priority of the League of Women Voters at the national, state, and local level. And countering this problematic information is key to advancing a better public understanding of the democratic and electoral process, which obviously is a very big goal of ours. And this work is important to building and restoring the public's trust in democracy, which I think we can see very clearly here in Wisconsin. So specifically what we're doing here at the Wisconsin State Office, we're taking steps to stop the spread of this information. So we recently hired a new voter services coordinator. Her name is Delaney Zimmer, and she will introduce herself in just a second. Delaney is working on poll worker recruitment, as well as helping to coordinate our new social media monitoring program. And we are currently looking for volunteers to join this program. So I'll pass it to Delaney to introduce herself and give us a quick little glimpse into the program, and then we'll get into the presentation.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Like Molly said, my name is Delaney, and I'm the voter services coordinator here at the State League. So we are currently recruiting people for our social media monitoring program. We will provide training on what to watch for on social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter, and also provide support for the volunteers who wish to monitor social media. This is a really great opportunity for people who are already comfortable on these types of social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter. In the follow-up email, you'll get a little bit more information, including the link to sign up. The training for this, the training for this opportunity is this Thursday, October 6th at 5 p.m. The training will be recorded just like this one for those who cannot attend or wish to join the program at a later date, maybe not right now. And all of those details will be sent out after the presentation tomorrow. So thank you all for coming.
Awesome. Thanks, Delaney. So now we'll introduce our speaker. So Dee Hall co-founded the Wisconsin Center for Investigative Journalism. She joined the staff as managing editor in June 2015. She's responsible for the center's daily news operations, and she worked at the Wisconsin State Journal for 24 years as an editor and reporter focusing on projects and investigations. And we are really lucky to have her here today to talk to us a bit more about disinformation. Thank you, Dee.
Thanks a lot. And I was really glad to hear the efforts that you guys are making to work to try to curb mis and disinformation, because there are things that we can do about it. It's not all is lost. So again, Dee Hall, managing editor, have a deep interest in curbing disinformation and misinformation as a reporter for about 40 years, but who's counting? So next slide. So in the old days, your trusty newspaper arrived at your doorstep and you had little reason to question whether the information in it was accurate or where it came from. Next slide. But technological and economic forces, including the emergence of the internet, have drastically reduced revenue to newspapers. Next slide. Now, newsrooms are half the size they were just in 2008. And just recently, Gannett, which owns 11 newspapers in Wisconsin, laid off hundreds of people across the country. Next slide. And many newspapers are just gone. At least 77 papers have shuttered in Wisconsin in recent years, and readership in newspapers is down by 1 million people, which is significant if you think that if you take into consideration, Wisconsin only has about 6 million people. Next slide. And what happens when newspapers die? Here's what researchers have found. There's lower voter turnout. There are fewer competitive races for office. Voters don't know who's running for Congress. Government waste increases when reporters and the public aren't watching. Businesses feel free to pollute, and regulators feel free to look the other way. And so when fact-based news disappears, residents start to get information from biased sources instead of nonpartisan ones, which hardens their political positions. The bottom line, no news is bad news for democracy. Slide 7. So trust in mainstream media has also declined, although it's a bit better than it was in 2016 at the height of the Russian disinformation campaign. Next slide. So media that report only one side of the story further erode that trust. Millions of Americans get their news exclusively from Fox News on the right or MSNBC on the left. This split makes viewers unaware of, or sometimes hostile to, perspectives different from the ones they see on TV. And what they see is often not reporting, but commentary. Here in Wisconsin, we have seen the emergence of news reports from outlets with ideological agendas, either hidden or overt, with little or no disclosure of who funds the work. That can lead to confusion over what's fact and what's opinion. Next slide. Gallup sums it up this way, quote, Americans' trust in the media has been eroding over time. But in the current highly polarized climate, the views of political partisans have become increasingly divergent. President Donald Trump's description of the media as, quote, the enemy of the people has undoubtedly colored the views of all Americans. Next slide. And this goes without saying, but you can't trust everything you read on the internet. Next slide. Writing a few months ago, researchers from Brookings found that, quote, one of the drivers of decreased confidence in the political system has been the explosion of misinformation deliberately aimed at disrupting the democratic process. This confuses and overwhelms voters. They went on to say, throughout the 2020 election cycle, Russia's cyber efforts and online actors were able to influence public perceptions. And they sought to amplify mistrust in the electoral process by denigrating mail-in voting, highlighting alleged irregularities, and accusing the Democratic Party of engaging in voter fraud. The quote, big lie, which was reinforced by President Trump about the 2020 election results, amplified the Russian efforts and has lasting implications on voters' trust in election outcomes. Next slide, please. In fact, the internet and social media have become major sources of disinformation, leading to further media distrust as explosive quote unquote stories like the child sex ring run by Hillary Clinton at a Washington, D.C. pizza restaurant are contradicted or ignored by mainstream news outlets. This process prompts consumers of actual fake news to distrust the real factual news. A 2021 poll found that 15% of Americans believe in QAnon. And recently, supporters of the bizarre conspiracy theory have gotten cues from Trump that he's on their side. He wore a Q pin to one of his rallies and played the movement's theme song during the event, prompting his QAnon supporters to point to the sky in a "Where we go one, we go all" salute. Slide 13. In the January 6th riot, conspiracy theories pushed by QAnon and the Stop the Steal movement collided, prompting thousands of people to storm the US Capitol to try to halt the certification of Joe Biden as president. Some protesters attacked police, and half a dozen deaths, including 4 officers who took their own lives, are blamed on the incident. Slide 14. So obviously, disinformation is dangerous. And moving from politics, everyone probably knows someone who refuses to be vaccinated because they think vaccines have microchips or the government is lying about their safety. Or COVID deniers who rely on quack cures pushed by charlatans profiting from the pandemic. Or people who believe that stay-at-home orders were a form of government control, prompting some people to take up arms and march on state capitals. That happened right here in Wisconsin. And militia members from Wisconsin who were opposed to Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer's efforts to contain the pandemic in her state were involved in the plot to kidnap her and put her on trial in a rural area just north of Madison. Another danger caused by this level of mis and disinformation, many nurses and nursing home workers refuse to be vaccinated, endangering themselves and the people in their care. Next slide. Disinformation is not only dangerous, it is stealthy. So if you look on the left, this is a heartwarming little tweet, looks like, about this, young man who has overcome great adversity in his life to help other people who are less fortunate. But Rolling Stone magazine found that the author of this account, I Am Tyra Jackson, was the successor to Russia's Internet Research Agency, which trolled US voters in 2016. According to Rolling Stone, quote, the purpose of the Tyra account, we believe, was not to spread heartwarming messages to Americans. Rather, the tweet about work done was really a Trojan horse to gain followers in a larger plan by a foreign adversary. In the case of I Am Tyra Jackson, the IRA's goal was twofold: grow an audience, in part through heartwarming, inspiring messages, and then use that following to spread messages prompting division, distrust, and doubt. Next slide, please. Disinformation can also be discriminatory. According to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, Russian active measures, campaigns, and interference, quote, by far, race and related issues were the preferred target of the information warfare campaign designed to divide the country in 2016, with 66% of the Internet Research Agency's paid Facebook ads invoking race, quote, principally aimed at African Americans in key metropolitan areas. Next slide, please. So why would they be targeting African Americans, African American residents? The Select Committee found the goal was to weaponize, quote, race, immigration, and Second Amendment rights in an attempt to pit Americans against one another and against their government. Next slide, please. In 2016, NPR found a purveyor of fake news in suburban LA. The owner of Disinfomedia said he started the company to discredit the quote unquote alt-right, but ended up making money by passing along all kinds of fake stories that were shared and believed by millions of people. NPR found Disinfomedia owner Justin Kohler employed as many as 25 people to write fake stories for clients, most of them on the right side of the political spectrum. He spread fake stories from legitimate sounding websites such as the National Report or the Denver Guardian. One story falsely reported that Coloradans were buying marijuana with food stamps. Kohler told NPR, quote, what that turned into was a state representative in the House in Colorado proposing actual legislation to prevent people from using their food stamps to buy marijuana based on something that had just never happened. Next slide, please. Former InfoWars writer Josh Owens has written a first-person story for the New York Times Magazine, revealing the ways in which Alex Jones manipulates his radio listeners with fake and twisted quote-unquote news that seeks to inflame conservatives and boost support for then-President Donald Trump. Jones convinced many in his audience that the 2012 Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting in Newtown, Connecticut, in which 20 students and 6 school staff were killed, was a hoax. The dead children and their parents were actors, he claimed, hired by the government to whip up anti-gun sentiment. In fact, the federal government never did enact gun restrictions after that shooting. Next slide, please. In another story about a peaceful Muslim-dominated community in upstate New York, Owens said Jones ordered them to paint the people there as terrorists in training. This type of messaging filters up and down. At one point during the campaign, Donald Trump claimed that Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama actually founded the terrorist organization ISIS. Next slide, please. Of course, as we all probably know, Jones has now been forced to acknowledge that he lied about the 26 people killed at Sandy Hook Elementary, that it wasn't a government plot to enact gun control, but a terrible and preventable mass shooting of innocent children and school employees. Jones's lies subjected the families of dead children to become targets of death threats and challenges to their character. Jones has already been ordered to pay the parents tens of millions of dollars, and some additional cases are still pending. Slide 22. So here's the reality. The number of newspapers is down. The number of reporters covering news is down. Hard-hitting news is very expensive to generate, and the public's trust in news is declining. At Wisconsin Watch, we try to provide an antidote to these corrosive trends. We are nonpartisan and nonprofit. We fully reveal all of our funders, and our stories are intensely fact-checked. Next slide, please. Our mission is to increase the quality, quantity, and understanding of investigative journalism to foster an informed democracy and informed citizenry and strengthen democracy. Next slide, please. Our guiding values are to protect the vulnerable, expose wrongdoing, and explore solutions. Slide 25. We tell uncomfortable truths that are sometimes hard to dig out. We revealed that Wisconsin had kept an inmate in solitary for 27 years. We were able to tell his story only after he was moved to the Wisconsin Resource Center, where inmates are allowed to speak to the media because they're considered to be patients and not inmates. After he sued the state, LaRon McKinley Bay was allowed to quietly transfer to a prison in Colorado, where he is no longer in solitary. Next slide, please. Our stories have impact, and sometimes it's huge. In 2013, we found Wisconsin was declining to take $14 million in federal funding to help people with disabilities get work. After our story ran, Governor Scott Walker reversed the policy, and a waiting list of 3,000 people with disabilities was erased. Slide 27, please. When Wisconsin Watch's Bram Sablesmith found people in 2020 with disabilities who were being excluded from pandemic unemployment assistance given to other idle workers, Governor Tony Evers' administration quickly changed course and began awarding this special pandemic aid to people with disabilities. Number 20, or next slide, please. We have a broad base of support from foundations and individuals who believe in the truth, including more than 700 individual donors. Next slide. We are also super collaborators, working with both nonprofit and for-profit media outlets to investigate issues of importance to Wisconsin. Along with our trusted media partners, we bring news that you can count on. Next slide. Because of our commitment to transparency in 2018, we were invited to join the Trust Project, a global network of news organizations that pledge to help people assess the credibility of the stories they read. Trust Project members commit to ethical practices, inclusive reporting, fact-checking, and correcting errors. We also explain how and why we do stories. For example, I wrote a column a few years ago explaining why we waited 18 months to tell the story of Roberto, a man who had been labor trafficked from Mexico, and the steps we took to protect him from harm. Next slide, please. How else do we earn trust? One way is through rigorous fact-checking of our stories. We check each number. We check the spelling of each name. We verify a person's title and affiliations. We use transcripts of taped interviews to make sure quotes are accurate, word for word. And we make sure those quotes are used in the right context. Even veteran reporters like former Wisconsin Watch staff member Bill Leaders go through the process. Here he stands next to 4 years worth of fact-checking files along with his lovely dog, Stella. Next slide, please. In 2020, we partnered with, so what is Wisconsin Watch doing to combat disinformation? In 2020, we partnered with UW-Madison's Center for Journalism Ethics to produce toolkits for journalists and the public on how to handle and respond to mis and disinformation. And I would really recommend taking a look at those, especially the consumer toolkit will really help you get some strategies for trying to combat it in your own world. So these resources are still available on the Ethics Center website. Next slide, please. We have some exciting news. We just joined a new project called GigaFact. It produces short 140-word fact checks on claims made on social media. Our project focuses on claims made about candidates and issues in the 2020 midterm elections. We've published a handful of these so far. It just started up last week. Next slide, please. And starting in 2023, we will be the guinea pigs, so to speak, for a new tool designed at the UW-Madison to detect and ideally counteract disinformation before it spreads. Researchers from UW-Madison and elsewhere will study how journalists use their course correct tool and what impact, if any, their stories have on the spread of disinformation. The funding will allow us to hire a full-time disinformation reporter for at least 18 months. I'm very excited about this project. Next slide, please. So you're wondering, well, what can you do to stop the spread of mis and disinformation? First, I'm going to give a little definition. Misinformation. Well, let's start with disinformation. Disinformation is designed to deceive people. So you think of the D, it's designed to deceive people. Misinformation is, generally speaking, is when somebody unwittingly spreads something that is not true. So they're not aiming to deceive you. They think they're actually spreading correct information. So I'll talk about mis and disinformation, but one of them is really directed and it's intentional, and the other one is often just an accident. So how do you stop the spread? Make sure to assess the quality of the news you use by checking who are the sources, who is quoted, or is the story filled with anonymous sources? Anyone can claim an anonymous source told them something. Unless the news organization is well respected, don't trust those unnamed sources. Is there independent confirmation? So one question you'll look at is, are there any other credible news outlets reporting or citing this story? If not, it's either a huge scoop or it's a huge scoop of poop. Are there supporting documents or data? Does the story cite and ideally link to documents or data? Are those documents genuine? Is the source of the data credible? Where does the news source get its revenue? If it's a typical newspaper, radio, or TV station, revenue comes from advertising that you can see. But if a news website does not reveal its funding, be wary. It likely has a hidden agenda. Another thing to look for is, does the news outlet correct its stories when it gets something wrong? We're all humans. We all make mistakes. Even our fact-checking system, sometimes things slip through the cracks. So, but if you notice that this or news outlet is never correcting anything, then it may be spreading propaganda and not real information. Another thing to consider is, does the news outlet have a consistent partisan or ideological bent? If so, it may have an agenda, hidden or overt, that keeps it from reporting news critically from a variety of legitimate viewpoints and a variety of sources. Next slide, please. So some final thoughts on ways to become a better news consumer. Refrain from spreading misinformation on social media. You know, the posts and tweets I'm talking about, yep, from that relative. Avoid living in a news bubble. Read, listen to, and watch news from diverse sources. Get involved in issues that matter to you. Support news organizations, whether they are nonprofit or for-profit, that you trust. Donate and subscribe. Next slide, please. And thanks again for taking time and your time and attention to delve into this important issue. We'd love to hear from you. We're currently working on election-related stories about threats against poll workers, false statements being spread by candidates or their allies, and access, and whether people are having trouble accessing voting. So I've got my email address here. It's dhall@wisconsinwatch.org if you have any election-related tips. And I'm happy to take questions.
Great, thank you so much, Dee. And again, we will follow up with everything in the email, including Dee's information and the relevant topics they're looking into. Also, the toolkits you mentioned, those will be a great resource. Can you tell us a bit more about what's in those toolkits from the Ethics Center?
So the one toolkit is for journalists, and it has a lot of practical information on how to avoid amplifying. So one of the conundrums you run into is when you try to correct disinformation or misinformation, you can inadvertently amplify that information. So they have various strategies for avoiding that. A lot of times, one of the strategies is called a truth sandwich, which is basically say what's true, mention what the false thing is that's been said about that, and then finish it with what is actually true. So you're emphasizing and re-emphasizing what's true while nodding to and ideally correcting what is not true. So that's just one of the journalism strategies. They also have strategies for headlines, to make sure that they don't mislead people. Then the other toolkit for citizens, for regular people, is probably most useful to this crowd, because there it tells you, for example, it gives you helpful hints on, okay, let's say you have somebody in your orbit who is constantly spreading disinformation. How do you handle that? Well, it's not one answer, but you kind of judge on how they react when you try to correct them. What I try to do with people who I think are genuinely spreading things that they think are true is I might just actually respond to their let's say their tweet or their Facebook post with, well, you should check this out because it looks like maybe that's not true or that isn't true. And I'll just put it in there very kind of gently, not, no bomb throwing. If it's somebody who's pretty hostile, and that could include relatives, not naming names, you might just do a direct message to them, either on Twitter or Facebook or whatever platform you see it on. Just to kind of tell them, look, you're saying this, people believe it, but here's a fact check. It's not true. The other thing that you'll see in there is, excuse me, the other thing you'll see in there are some trusted places to go, or, if you yourself are wondering, is something true, use the checklist that I mentioned, which is drawn somewhat from the toolkit. But also, there's Snopes, the Washington Post does fact checking, the New York Times does fact checking, PolitiFact, factcheck.org, GigaFact now, feel free to check all those places and even just Google fact check and then put the information in there. And a lot of times you'll come up with somebody has looked into the claim and decided whether it was true or not true.
Yeah, and everyone has that one family member.
Oh, at least one.
Yeah, at least one.
I wish I could say they're all on my husband's side, but they're not.
We have a question in the chat. It seems that people are buying into the awful TV ads that are being played repeatedly. I was led to believe that people don't pay attention to TV campaign ads, but the polls from various news sites like Fox News seem to be suggesting that people are putting credits to these in this election. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I haven't looked at the research recently, but as much as we don't like this, people say, oh, I hate these negative ads, I hate them, but they are influential. Because often what you're dealing with is two or more candidates. You don't really know any of them personally, but when you hear something really bad about them, think about it in your own life, for example. You find out that a friend is dating somebody, and then you find out something terrible about the friend, or about the date, the person. You don't really know that person, but that's going to color everything you think about them because you have no countervailing information. If you know them personally, of course, then you could say, well, that's ridiculous, or I'm sure that's not true, or if it is true, there must have been a good reason for that. But so that's the problem, is they take relatively unknown people, even if they're a US senator, you don't know them personally. You're able to really throw a lot of dirt, and it is effective, unfortunately. So that's why you're seeing them, because they work. If they didn't work, you wouldn't see them.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it looks like we have another question in the chat. It looks like this person is wondering if the polling data that we hear is also skewed. So if you're seeing polling data on Fox News, would you expect that to be skewed to the right, or does that come from different sources?
Well, weirdly enough, Fox News actually, when it comes to polling, apparently has a pretty good reputation. So there are sites that sort of rate, and I think it's, I'll think of it in a minute. I've got 578, 568, 570. Tell me, what are the three numbers? 536, whatever.
538. 538.
Thank you. 538. Oh my God. When you have those brain farts, just horrible. Anyway, 538 ranks the credibility of polls. So I would look at that, because what they're doing is they're ranking them, they're looking at the quality of the questions, because, you can ask a really misleading question like, don't you think that people should be allowed to protect their wives and children from murderous thugs? I mean, no, I don't. I mean, of course, everyone's going to say yes. But then that's then portrayed as being a pro-gun, position. So they look at the quality of the questions. They look at the quality of the sample size. That's a huge thing. Is it a representative sample? When you start to get into self-selected polls, like online polls where anybody can answer those, then the confidence starts to drop down. That's another thing to look at with polls. What's the margin of error? And some people don't know this, but when it says margin of error of 3 points, that's plus or minus 3 points. That means 6. So if you say so-and-so is ahead in the race, but they're within the margin of error, it's possible they're not ahead at all. So that's something to look at. And then so you'd look at the reputation of the polling organization, the sample size, was it big or small? Was it a self-selected group of people who are really jazzed up about something, so they choose to answer the survey? So those are the sources I would look for. I will say that I think the polling industry has undergone a sort of a come to Jesus moment, so to speak, over the past couple of elections, because especially in 2016, they really muffed it in some races. And I think, there are a lot of reasons for that. And I don't know most of what they are. Thank you for putting the, yes, 538. Now I'll remember that. So that's another place. That's what I would look at too. I will say the Marquette Law School poll is well respected. They do a good job of polling Wisconsin, and we tend to look at that. But there are some other Wisconsin polls too that are legitimate.
Awesome, thank you. I want to bring up this point that Beverly put in the chat. She talked about the concept of informational learned helplessness. People become overwhelmed until it becomes almost impossible to separate fact from fiction or trace an idea back to its source. Dee, have you guys been doing anything about that concept, or
not the concept, but I understand it. I think people are overwhelmed by the news. We've had an information revolution. I think about when I was a reporter, and this is old timey, but we didn't have even fax machines. If you wanted to get a report from Washington, you had to pick up the phone and dial it. You probably couldn't leave a message because they didn't have answering machines, and ask them to send you a report, which would come 5 or 6 days later. But now a person can press a button and I've got a 500-page report. And so news gets put out there so fast, it's so easy to get, right? And so you're getting blasted with information all the time. And it's easy to just sort of tune out. So sometimes people will tune out, and if they tune out enough, they may end up just sort of accessing the news outlets that reinforce their own views of things, which we tend to do anyway, right? I mean, if you are a person who is from the left side of the spectrum, you're probably not going to spend a lot of time watching Fox News, possibly no time. And so whatever your positions are, they get more and more hardened, and you become less, would I say, open to any information that would contradict that viewpoint or that information that you are consuming on a regular basis. So I may not have answered the question correctly, and if I'd be happy for clarification if I didn't do that.
It wasn't so much a question, so it was totally good. I would be interested about hearing like the evolution of disinformation throughout your reporting career.
Well, I'll tell you that I'm old enough now where when I started, it was just some network TV and a couple of cable stations, literally just a couple. It was CNN and it was, I can't remember. Anyway, that was it. And back when I was young, it felt more like people agreed on the facts, what are the actual facts, but they disagreed about maybe the importance of the facts or how one should view the facts. So there weren't just a lot of disputes about the facts, that they were kind of what they were. I always tell people that, I'm 5'10" and I weigh 120 pounds online, but the real facts don't match those numbers. And those other numbers are objectively true, which I'm not going to say what they are. So that I think what has happened now is we don't all agree on the same facts anymore, let alone the same, conclusion about those facts. And so that is what I've seen over, especially accelerated over the past 8 years or so. I recall very vividly about 10 years ago when somebody from the state of Wisconsin was basically lying to me, and I knew it because it's a story I'd been investigating, and it was a spokesperson for a state agency. And I was just, I mean, I was so livid. I was almost flabbergasted. I was almost speechless, although I did later figure out what to say. And it was pretty loud and it was pretty outraged. And I told that spokesperson that I was not going to be reporting what she just said because she knew what she just said was not true. And we are not going to be the purveyors of false information, regardless of how often she says it or how she says it. And I was just, I mean, I was just flabbergasted by that. But now it's routine, not necessarily from government sources, but it's routine that people will just simply lie to you about objective, easily verifiable facts. And those will become, for some people, the real facts, whereas the real facts become fake news. So it's all topsy-turvy. I have, that's why I'm so concerned about dis and misinformation, because if we cannot agree on basic facts, like what you see going on in Russia now. In Russia, there's no war in Ukraine. It's a special military operation and they're winning and everything's great. And those were all Nazis over there. So you can see the toxic and pervasive nature of disinformation when you have a controlled media environment like that.
And then we have some people in the chat hoping you could talk a bit more about the GigaFacts.
Oh, so GigaFact, right now we just started it, and there's a website called GigaFact, and you can just Google that. And so these are very short yes, no questions. We're part of a small pilot because they've done a bunch of research to figure out that fact checks should be shorter, and then fact checks should be yes or no answers. Now you have 140 words to explain why it's a yes or no, and also to give it the proper context. Like I said, we just got started on this. We're just generating our first 10 or so, and within the next hopefully week we'll have a space on our website that will highlight these fact checks. We'll also have a little thing that you can click on if you heard or read something that you think is false. This would be a good thing for your disinformation folks to do. You can submit it to that tool, and it'll tell you, is there already a fact check on that? If not, you can request a fact check from us. So I'm super excited about it. It's a small thing we're doing. Some people have said, well, we're not sure fact checking works. And it's kind of like, well, you know what? I'm willing to try everything right now. And if it doesn't work, at least we tried.
That sounds so awesome. I'm super excited about that.
Great. Yeah, I am too. And it's just, will it work? Are we just, spitting into the wind? I don't know, but I feel like we have to try it. We got the opportunity. We were chosen to participate. And so we're going to do our darndest to, shed a little bit of light out there, and hopefully it'll, shed light in the dark corners.
That's great. Dorothy is wondering, is there any hope of reviving independent local newspapers, digital or print?
Well, I mean, if you look at, when you mean independent, I mean not owned by a chain? Dorothy, would you turn your microphone off? Well, if you mean not owned by a chain, yes, that's what you mean. Answer is probably in the short term, no. Because the same economics that are applying to that have led to this great downfall and shrinkage of newspapers apply there. What I will say though is there are some emerging small nonprofit news organizations that are beginning to fill in the gap. We're like Wisconsin Watch is never going to be as large as the Wisconsin State Journal used to be, I don't think, back when I was working there I worked there for 24 years, but when we started in the early 90s. But we are starting to make gains there. My husband, Andy, was one of the originators of something called the Independent News Network. It started out with 26 members. It now has over 400. A lot of these are, some of them are hyper local, some of them are state focused, some of them are focused on things like the environment or, consumer safety or things of that nature. So there is an emerging, I'm sorry, it's the Institute for Nonprofit News. But anyway, there is an emerging sector that's growing of independent nonprofit news organizations that are starting up in communities. They're mostly online based, although some do some kind of print publication, and some are, would be radio or audio reports. But yeah, I mean, it is growing, and it's grown a lot. And we at Wisconsin Watch have actually grown a lot over the past 2 years. We got some transformational funding from something called the American Journalism Project, which is seeking to do exactly what they're doing with us, which is make nonprofit news organizations more sustainable over the long term. I mentioned in my slide that we have a lot of major funders and we have a lot of individual contributors. They're helping us learn how to make that keep going. We're 13 years old now. We hope to be 113 at some point. I won't be here anymore, but but this is the new wave. But it is a very labor intensive. I know that people run like a small news outlet in Wausau. That is really hard stuff. Or down in Racine, the Racine County Eye. I mean, that is really hard work, but people are doing it, and we're getting a little bit of that. But it's not at this moment. It doesn't replace all the reporters we lost from the chain owners and the mains in mostly mainstream media.
And Fran is wondering if there's any mechanism to communicate with and influence news outlets like local TV and persuade them not to continue to run misleading and damaging political ads or just information.
Well, that's a tough one, because I mean, there are occasions where political ads are taken down because they are so false or defamatory that the station will take them down. And if it's in that category, I would go ahead and write to the station, because they are they're regulated by the Federal Communications Commission. Newspapers aren't, but over-the-air broadcasters are. So it doesn't hurt to write to them. I will say that I don't know how successful you'll be as an individual. If a bunch of people get together and all say, this is really terrible and we are boycotting your station or something like that, then it might have some impact. But it's kind of a free speech thing too. I just met with a bunch of journalists from around the world, and it was so interesting. They are A, super impressed with our First Amendment, and B, recognize its dangers. And they're right about both, right? Because anybody can say anything short of fire in a crowded theater or defaming a person and their reputation, because we live in a free country. But that also allows people to spread mis and disinformation really without consequence. So it has its downsides, but I guess I'd be probably one of the last people to say we shouldn't have a First Amendment, or that we should somehow make it only, subject to some kind of government control, because that's the exact opposite of what we need.
And related to that, can you talk about what, if any, like legal guards are in place to protect against disinformation?
So what we have is a system of basically civil court actions. And again, it rarely happens, but you will see sometimes a person will sue saying that this news organization or that one defamed me. Or in the case of like Alex Jones, for example, his news organization, such as it is, his propaganda arm, I'll call it, was sued by parents who basically drew a direct line between what he was saying and the threats they were receiving at their homes, and their characters being smeared. And they won that case, but that's a rare kind of thing. So, essentially, if you feel like you're being defamed, you might have an action. But if you just are tired of somebody putting out false information, there's not a lot you can do except to try to correct it. Perhaps if they have some kind of, I don't know, corporate structure, you could appeal to the corporate structure. It's a really tough one. There aren't a lot of mechanisms. Now, I know that Facebook, Twitter, less so Twitter, but more Facebook, and some of the other platforms do have some moderation, and you can always complain. That may or may not have any impact in such a massive company, but you can certainly do that as well.
Thanks, Dee. And a question I have is, a lot of journalists are on Twitter, and, I tend to get my news from following individual journalists, not even so much like newsrooms. So how can people fact check and make sure that they're following, like you verify the journalists and the individuals that they're following?
Well, so yeah, that's a good suggestion. You can curate your own information flow by blocking. I know somebody who did this for her mother, who was getting deep into the disinformation rabbit hole. And she said, Mom, let me update your Facebook thing. And she just got rid of all these crazy wackadoodle things. I wouldn't recommend that, but I thought it was funny. But it shows you it's possible, right? So if you're starting to get some weird stuff that you really find disturbing, or, first of all, you can post on it and tell them this is not true. You can also just block it. And I've had to do that with people I know. I just don't want to see what they're putting out there. It's toxic. And at some point, they lose enough people following them that maybe they're screaming into the wind. So, but yeah, I would say curate. That's why I say look at, legitimate sources of news, using that kind of criteria, and then definitely follow reporters, follow news organizations that you trust. I did not mention this, but I should. There are 2 or 3 different sites that rate the partisanship and the accuracy of news organizations, and they put them on a spectrum. So you can find like, oh, here's the Washington Post. It's a little bit here to the left, but it's really high when it comes to factuality. And oh, here's this other, thing, and it's way down here, and it's very far to the left or right, and it often has errors and factual errors. So there are organizations like that. I think I'll put that in my slide presentation next time. So that's one way for you to evaluate the news organization itself. And then, of course, if you find one that's really biased and also bonus is really full of factual errors, then I would just not look at them anymore, and I would block them from my social media if possible.
And then Wendy has a question. Do you know of any K-12 curriculum that teaches what you have been talking about tonight? And if not, do you think this is something that could help equip future voters to make more informed decisions?
I am not, but I know that we've been covering democracy-related issues a lot in the last couple of years, and I know that there is somewhat of a movement towards civics education, which I would hope would include media literacy. I do think it's important because I think it's sort of like those people who talk you into vehicle warranties that you don't need. It's like that. It's like really designed to deceive, and it really sucks people in. If you're not wary, if you're not skeptical, if you don't, if you're just, it's sort of washing over you, it's easy to be influenced by this stuff. So I would, I would recommend that, I just find this so fascinating, so horrible, the impact that this kind of information can have. So let's see. But I don't know of any curriculum. I would definitely support it. And I would love to see it, because I do think, like our kids grew up in a family with 2 reporters, so they're pretty media literate. They can tell the wheat from the chaff, but a lot of people are not in that kind of household, or they don't have that information. And I would very much support it. If you find one, let me know. I'd love to profile it.
And then we have another question. Can you talk a bit more about the sustainability of Wisconsin Watch, and specifically like with grant funding?
Right. So that is a somewhat of a tenuous life to be in. We get funders who fund us anywhere from 1 year to 3 years. Sometimes the grants are very large, sometimes they're small. Every nonprofit news organization that I know of, and these are the ones I know of, there's big ones like ProPublica that started out with like $26 million endowment. That's very unusual. Usually they start out like we did, in the basement of our house with Andy working there, and then I joined and we hired a couple people. That's how a lot of them are. So, and some of them haven't made it, because one of the things you figure out really quickly is you can have great journalism, but if you don't have a great business operation, then you will probably not succeed. And just like, there are papers that have great reporters and they have great stories, and they still don't succeed because the business model for newspapers, for example, has gone down. So when we first started it, my husband Andy thought he'd be doing a bunch of reporting because he'd been an investigative reporter for years. And then he discovered immediately that he mainly had to keep his eye on making sure we're sustainable. So we do sustain by having some major donors. We do, the policies are all on our website, but the donors don't tell us, what to do, or or how to report on something. And if they don't like the way we're doing something, they can just stop funding us in the next funding cycle. But we stay independent of that kind of pressure. So we have a combination of general operating grants where they say, hey, we love what you're doing, here's the money. We have other ones where they are like, we support environmental reporting. Okay, we do environmental reporting. Is there a project that fits our mission and our current priorities that we could tap into? So that's one way we sustain it, is by basically getting support for specific areas of coverage. Again, the funders can't tell us what to write. We could conclude that PFAS are great, or whatever. But the other way we do it is we are a real training ground for young journalists, and we have gotten funded fellowships and internships from all over the country and around the world. Actually, we just had a fellow from Nepal who came with 100% funding, and he did a great story for us about logging in the North Woods. So, these are the kinds of things that and so it's not one source. It's a bunch of sources, including our hundreds of individual donors. So, every year, how sustainable are we? That's always a question, but I will say that as part of the American Journalism Project, they took a deep dive into our finances and our sustainability. And they said, we don't invest in losers. And so there are just a couple dozen news organizations that they've invested in, and they've decided to invest in us. So we appreciate that. But it also gives me a good feeling that they use BDO. You probably see their commercials, Ask BDO. Well, BDO came in and looked at us and said, yeah, you guys are doing well. So
we have lots of great questions in the chat. So sorry if we don't get to everyone's before we head out in like 7 minutes. Let's see. Do you distinguish between disinformation and propaganda? And then also double part question, can you recommend a good resource to help us learn to recognize propaganda techniques?
Yeah, so I think one is disinformation is the stuff they're putting out, and propaganda is the way they do it. If you look at like RT America, for example, which is Russia Today, they are a propaganda arm of the Russian government. And what they put out is disinformation aimed at whatever the goal is, the Russian government at any one time. I don't necessarily distinguish between them. Propaganda generally is, and I use that term very loosely, propaganda is often put out by a government. So, whereas disinformation can be spread by anyone. So I guess that would be the distinction, but they're both basically false information put out intended to deceive people.
And then another question, wondering about podcasts, because I know a lot of people get their news from podcasts. Thoughts on podcasts for communicating accurate news and analysis?
Right. And again, it's just like any news outlet. You look at the podcast and you figure out, are these credible people? Like we put out a podcast, Open and Shut, which I would recommend everyone listen to because it's wonderful. We spent tens of thousands of dollars on legal review, in addition to weeks and weeks of fact checking. We had thousands and thousands of facts that we checked. So that's you can rely on that. We did our very best to make it as absolutely accurate and fair as anybody could possibly do it. There are other people who just have a microphone and they just go blah, 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 whatever comes out of their mouth. So there's a big difference between a produced and reported podcast and some person just talking. Now, some of my favorite ones are a combination. They're people I trust and they're just talking. That's okay. Like I listened to Preet Bharara, who's a former U.S. attorney for Manhattan. And he does great legal analysis. I trust that whatever he's saying, he believes it to be true and he's got a basis for saying it. Other people I wouldn't put in that category. So
I love Preet's podcast.
I know. I'm addicted.
And we'll definitely include Open and Shut in the follow-up. I'd recommend you all check that out. That's really great.
It's about prosecutors and the power they have and how that power can be perverted.
Another question is just, maybe local league members have reporters reach out to them. How can you kind of verify if this is someone I should talk to, or, sometimes people are nervous that their words might get twisted, but other times, even if it's coming from a news source you might not read yourself, it's good to get that information out there. Do you have any tips for that?
I would go through the same kind of checklist and ask them. So you said you're with the Daily Caller. So tell me a little bit about that news organization. Oh, who runs it? Where do you get your money? Are you know, that kind of stuff. And I don't think it's unreasonable, especially for people who don't deal with the media all the time. We're not talking about Governor Evers or people who deal with the media all the time. They're on their own. They can sink or swim. I'm talking about people probably like a lot of your members who only hear from a reporter once or twice a year, or maybe once in a lifetime. It's not unreasonable for you to ask them at the end of the interview, do you know what kind of quotes or information you plan to use? And I'm always happy to go back and do that. I'll say, well, I have this quote from you. I hope I can use it. And I'll just read it off to them. Because sometimes you say things and you insert something in there, or you omit something in the quote itself isn't that great anymore. And if you hear it read back to you, then you're like, oh, no, I meant to say not, where it says that I forgot the word not. Well, that's important. So I tell my reporters, if somebody wants to hear their quotes again, just, especially somebody who's not savvy with the media, do it. Because you want to represent what they said and meant to say as best you can. That's what it's about. So, so I would say, ask about the news organization, ask them, if it's okay, if you don't mind when you get close to publication, you mind shooting the quotes to me that you're planning to use, or can you read them to me right now? And usually I get like a verbal agreement to say, especially if somebody asks, but I could also offer it, say, yeah, here, I was really interested in that one figure and you said you're not sure about that. So I'm not going to use that from you, but where would I get that? So you can have a back and forth with them. It's not sort of it shouldn't be anyway. It shouldn't be a scary adversarial falling off the cliff kind of experience. It should really give you some confidence that they're listening to you, that they're taking down the information you gave them. And then they're willing to, adjust if it turns out that you misspoke, or there was that something you thought was true is really not, you don't know it. And a lot of times they'll ask things like, how do you know that? That's where you might yourself realize, oh yeah, that's the thing I heard from my neighbor. Not sure, you should check that one. And make it really clear if you're talking to them, I don't know this. This is what I've heard, it's secondhand. Don't quote me on it. Literally say stuff like that, because then they know if they run it, they're just being reckless and they're going against your wishes. So yeah, just tell them, don't quote me on this, but I heard that this town over there, well, they had 150% voter turnout because so many people registered on the day of, so again, make it clear. This is something I've heard. It's not something I know. Any other questions in our last?
I think we
30
got
seconds?
through all of them.
That's awesome.
Thank you so much, Dee. That was wonderful. And thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Again, everything will be sent out over email. And if you have any other following questions that pop up, feel free to reach out in the follow-up. And yeah, have a wonderful evening.
Don't forget my email address. Yeah, don't forget my email address if you have any election-related tips that we might be able to use in our future coverage. I appreciate it.
What was the name of the podcast?
It's called Open and Shut, and it was
the one from the the attorney from Manhattan.
It's Preet, Preet, and then Barara, which is BHARA, BHARRA. If you do Preet, you'll find him. Preet podcast, you'll find him.
It's very addicting.
It is addicting. I listen all the time. All right, guys. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Bye.